The Last Listener, Chapter 1, The Static and the Solstice. The city outside the soundproof glass of Studio A was a sprawling, indifferent beast, its million lights dimmed to a distant twinkle by the perpetual late-night haze. Inside, at KWYN 99.7 FM, the world was a quieter, more intimate place. Just the hum of the old console, the soft glow of monitors, and the low, steady hiss of the broadcast. Arthur Reeves, voice of Night Owls, was at the helm, a solitary captain navigating the choppy seas of insomnia and existential dread. It was 2:17 a.m., a Tuesday, or maybe a Wednesday. The days bled into one another in this windowless sanctum, measured only by the ebb and flow of caller IDs and the relentless sweep of the second hand on the studio clock. Arthur took a sip of lukewarm coffee, its bitterness a familiar balm against the encroaching silence. He leaned into the mic, a seasoned performer's practiced intimacy.
"And you're back with Arthur Reeves on Night Owls," he rumbled, his voice a gravelly comfort, worn smooth by decades of late-night confessions and philosophical meanderings. "Another hour, another opportunity to stare into the abyss. Or just tell me about that squirrel you saw trying to pickpocket a pigeon. Whatever keeps you awake, we're here to listen." Arthur had been doing this for 23 years. 23 years of holding court for the forgotten, the anxious, the perpetually awake. He was a professional listener, a confessor to a faceless congregation. His cynicism was a well-honed shield, deflecting the raw emotional energy that often crackled down the phone lines. He'd heard it all: alien abductions, ghost stories, pleas for lost love, diatribes against the current political climate. He offered no solutions, only an ear, and a dry, often sarcastic commentary.
Tonight the calls were a predictable mix. First up, Brenda from the South End, convinced her cat was communicating with her through interpretive dance. Arthur offered a deadpan suggestion about investing in tap shoes. Then came Mark, a student cramming for finals, spiraling into an existential crisis about the futility of human endeavor. Arthur told him to get some sleep. The third caller, a woman named Eleanor, spoke in hushed tones about the peculiar silence in her house since her husband passed. Not an empty silence, she explained, but a waiting silence. Arthur's practiced empathy kicked in, a brief flicker of genuine connection before his usual detachment reasserted itself. He played a brief, melancholic instrumental to break the segment, leaning back in his worn leather chair. The studio was his sanctuary, a bubble of manufactured connection in a world he increasingly found alienating. He liked the anonymity. The voice was known, but the man behind it remained largely unseen, unjudged. He was Arthur Reeves, the last listener, perched on the precipice of the waking world and the endless night. The red light on line 3 blinked. Another call, another soul battling the vast, indifferent dark. He took another gulp of coffee, adjusted his headphones, and hit the cue button. "You're on the air, Night Owl. What's keeping you up?" Chapter 2, The Eavesdropper. "Hello?" A man's voice, a little hoarse, crackled through the speakers. He sounded hesitant, like he was fumbling for words. "Is this Arthur?" "The one and only, as far as I know," Arthur replied, leaning back, a faint smile playing on his lips. "What's on your mind, caller? Or should I say, what's on your nightstand?" A pause, stretching a beat too long. "My name's George. I've never called a radio show before."
"There's a first time for everything, George. Don't sound so nervous. It's just me and a few thousand other insomniacs out here."
"No, it's not that."
George cleared his throat, his voice dropping to a near whisper, though the mic picked up every subtle inflection. It's stupid, really. My wife thinks I'm losing it." "Join the club, George. We meet Tuesdays and Thursdays, right here." Arthur's attempt at levity fell flat. "No, listen," George insisted, a tremor in his voice. "It started a few nights ago. Nothing major. Just, I'd say something, to myself. Like, did I lock the back door? Or, where did I leave my glasses? And then, a moment later,
I'd hear it back. Arthur's hand hovered over the delay button. This sounded like a classic case of sleep deprivation-induced auditory hallucinations. Or a prank. He'd heard enough of those. Hear what back, George? Your own voice?
Yes, exactly. But it's not my voice. Not really. It's like an echo, but different. Like someone standing right behind me, mimicking me. Just slightly wrong. Arthur scoffed, a soft sound into the microphone. Slightly wrong how, George? The cadence, George said, his voice now urgent, almost pleading. The emphasis. If I say, "Did I lock the back door?" it says, "Did I lock the back door?" Not a huge change, just enough to make it unsettling, like it's trying to learn. Arthur paused. He'd had callers describe voices in their heads, static on the line, radio waves from outer space. This was a new flavor of odd. George, I appreciate you sharing this, but it sounds like you might be a little overtired. Maybe your mind is playing tricks on you. Our brains do funny things when they don't get enough rest.
It's not that. I told you, my wife thinks I'm crazy. She doesn't hear it, but it's there. It's listening. A frantic edge had crept into George's voice. I just wanted to tell someone who would listen, someone who understands things that are beyond the usual. Arthur sighed internally. This was the part of the job he tolerated rather than enjoyed, the calls that skirted the edge of mental health issues, where a sympathetic ear was needed more than a snarky comment. He adopted a calmer, more reassuring tone. George, I hear you. It sounds like a truly unsettling experience, but sometimes our own minds can be the trickiest of all. Try to get some solid sleep. Maybe put on some white noise in your bedroom. Give your brain a break. White noise won't help, George mumbled, sounding deflated. It just makes the silence louder. A click, and the line went dead.
Arthur frowned. Usually callers stuck around for a bit more reassurance, or at least a polite goodbye. George had hung up abruptly. He shrugged it off. Another insomniac, another strange story. Just another Tuesday night. He played a commercial break, rubbing his temples. The call had left a faint, lingering taste of unease. It wasn't the content itself. He'd heard worse. It was the absolute conviction in George's voice, coupled with that peculiar detail. Slightly wrong. Like a child learning to parrot, but deliberately missing the point. He pushed the thought aside. He had a show to run. Probably a prank caller, testing the waters. He prepared for the next segment, ready to bat away the next oddity the night would throw at him. Chapter 3. The Expanding Chorus. The next night, a Wednesday, the calls started coming in faster than usual. It began innocuously enough. A woman, Clara, called in complaining about a phantom echo in her empty apartment.
I'll say good night, Clara, to myself, just out of habit since my dog passed, she explained, her voice fragile. And then I hear it, from the kitchen. Good night, Clara. Just like that, like a child trying to make fun. Arthur remembered George. He felt a familiar prickle of irritation. Was this a new urban legend being born? Some kind of mass suggestion spread by his very airwaves? He offered Clara the same advice he'd given George, albeit with less sincerity. Carbon monoxide, sleep deprivation, the power of suggestion. But then came David, a trucker on a long haul through the desolate plains, who swore he heard his own muttered curses echoed back from the empty passenger seat. I said, "Damn, another pothole," and I heard, "Damn, another pothole," a split second later. It's freaking me out, Arthur. I'm out in the middle of nowhere, just me and the road.
Arthur leaned closer to the mic, his skepticism hardening into something more defensive. David, my friend, the road can play tricks on you. Long hours, endless stretches of highway, you start hearing things. No, man, this is different. It's too clear, and it's not my voice. It's like a shadow of my voice, hollow. By the time he came back from the next commercial break, the switchboard was lit up like a Christmas tree. Maria from downtown, a usually unflappable nurse, sounded genuinely distraught. I swear, Arthur, I was just reorganizing my medicine cabinet, muttering to myself, why do I keep this expired cough syrup? And then I heard it from the hallway. Why do I keep this expired cough syrup? Just like that. My husband's asleep. The kids are at their grandmother's. There's no one here. Arthur felt a chill that had nothing to do with the studio's overzealous air conditioning. This was no longer isolated incidents.
It was a pattern. The same story, the same detail. A voice, an echo, a mimicry that was slightly wrong, deliberately off-kilter. He tried to laugh it off, injecting a forced jollity into his voice. All right, night owls. It sounds like we've got a new late-night phenomenon on our hands. The case of the mimicking echo. Perhaps it's a poltergeist with a penchant for poor grammar, or maybe the city's acoustics are just getting really weird. If you're hearing your words thrown back at you with a slight judgmental twist, give us a call. Misery loves company, after all.
But the levity felt brittle, even to him. He was supposed to be the cynical one, the anchor in the storm of other people's anxieties. Now, the storm felt like it was gathering around him. The calls continued, a terrifying chorus of confusion and fear. Each caller reported the same unnervingly precise delay, the slightly altered emphasis, the feeling of being watched, listened to. He ran through all the rational explanations in his head. A viral prank, perhaps. A challenge issued on some obscure online forum targeting his show specifically. Or maybe, just maybe, a collective hysteria, a shared delusion sparked by George's initial call. He wanted to believe it was one of those. He needed to believe it. As the clock ticked past 3 a.m., Arthur felt a knot tighten in his stomach. The desolate, melancholic atmosphere he usually cultivated in the studio had shifted. It was no longer a comforting quiet. It was a waiting quiet, a listening quiet.
And tonight, for the first time in his 23 years on air, Arthur Reeves, the professional listener, felt distinctly, unnervingly, heard. Chapter 4. The Sound of the Shift. The calls continued for the remainder of the week, a steady trickle that grew into a disturbing stream. Arthur started to feel a prickle of genuine unease, something beyond his practiced detachment. He even found himself muttering, "Did I lock the studio door?" and tensing, waiting for the phantom echo, the subtly altered reply. It never came, but the anticipation itself was unsettling. Then the emails started, and the packages. The first email was anonymous, a simple subject line, "Listen." Attached was an audio file. Arthur, wary, opened it on a separate, low-security computer. The file played. It was clearly recorded in a home, the ambient hum of a refrigerator in the background, a woman's voice, tired and exasperated. "Kids, get ready for bed, please. It's late."
A beat of silence. Then, from slightly further away, a sound like an exhalation, followed by the same words, but the cadence was off. The intent was wrong. "Kids, get ready for bed, please. It's late." The emphasis shifted, twisting a mother's loving command into something demanding, threatening almost. Arthur's blood ran cold. This wasn't just a quirky echo. This was a mimicry with malicious undertones. He swallowed hard, closing the file. This was beyond the purview of a late-night radio host. He thought about calling the police, but what would he say? "I'm receiving audio files of people's voices being slightly misspoken." They'd think he was losing it. The next package arrived via courier to the station. A plain brown box, no return address. Inside, nestled in shredded newspaper, was an old, cheap cassette recorder. A single cassette tape was tucked into its slot.
His producer, Brenda, a no-nonsense woman who had seen it all, watched him with a raised eyebrow as he stared at the package. "More fan mail, Arthur?" "Something like that," he muttered, grabbing the recorder and the tape. He retreated to his office, a dusty den filled with forgotten relics of radio history. He slid the tape in, pressed play. The hiss of the tape was loud, then a child's voice, young, maybe 6 or 7. "Daddy, I want a cookie." A pause. Then a second voice, thin and reedy like a stretched-out shadow, mimicking. "Daddy, I want a cookie." The child giggled. "No cookie." The mimicry. "No cookie." The child then said, with a distinct emphasis, "I want a chocolate chip cookie." The mimicry, distorted, slightly garbled, but chillingly clear. "I want a chocolate chip cookie." The pause between chip and cookie was unnatural, a breath held too long, like a system struggling to process. And the way cookie was said, almost like a question, an uncertain command. Arthur felt the hairs on his arms rise. This wasn't a prank anymore. This was a violation. Someone, something, was recording these instances. This wasn't mass hysteria. This was real, and it was spreading.
He played a few more fragments from the tape. Each one was a similar transcription of everyday speech, followed by the slightly wrong echo. A husband muttering to his wife, "Honey, did you see my keys?" echoed back as, "Honey, did you see my keys?" The emphasis shifted the meaning from a simple question to an implicit accusation. A teenager complaining, "Mom, I hate doing homework," echoed back as, "Mom, I hate doing homework." The mimicry somehow injected a venomous, almost rebellious edge into an ordinary complaint. The recordings were intimate, invasive. They were snippets of people's unguarded moments, their frustrations, their simple desires. And the echo wasn't just repeating. It was altering. It was taking the essence of what was said and twisting it, subtly, into something colder, something more deliberate.
He called Detective Miller, a contact he'd made years ago during a segment on cold cases. Miller listened patiently, but Arthur could hear the polite skepticisms in his voice. "Arthur, I appreciate you bringing this to me, but an echoing voice? A bad recording? There's no crime here, no evidence of a break-in, no threats. It sounds like a sophisticated prank, or perhaps a mental health issue for the callers." "It's not a prank, Miller," Arthur insisted, his voice tight. "These are genuine recordings, and the pattern is too precise, too consistent. It's in people's homes, Miller. Children are hearing it." Miller promised to keep an ear out and suggested Arthur maybe take a vacation. Arthur hung up, frustrated and alone. He was the only one connecting the dots, the only one seeing the creeping shadow. He walked back into the studio, the familiar lights and monitors now feeling less like a sanctuary and more like a surveillance post. The microphone, usually a conduit for connection, now felt like a direct line to something unknown. He was broadcasting into the night, and something out there, something that shifted meaning with a breath, was listening. And for the first time in a very long time, Arthur Reeves felt truly, deeply afraid. Chapter 5. The Studio's New Voice. The following night, Arthur was back in the studio, a skeletal crew in the adjacent control room. Brenda was there, monitoring levels, and a junior engineer, Kevin, was making sure everything ran smoothly. Arthur tried to project an air of normalcy, but the recordings from the previous day had burrowed deep under his skin. He found himself scanning the dark corners of the studio, half expecting to see a shimmering distortion, hear a whispered echo of his own thoughts. He was mid-sentence, introducing a new call from a woman who claimed her toaster was repeating her grocery list, when the studio phone rang. It wasn't the main broadcast lines, which glowed red when active. It was the internal studio line, the one that only rang if Brenda or Kevin were trying to reach him directly. But Brenda was busy adjusting a fader, and Kevin was engrossed in a wiring diagram. Neither of them had picked up their own phones. The ring was soft, almost tentative, a single electronic chirp that cut through the comforting hum of the equipment. Arthur paused, mid-word. His eyes flickered to Brenda, whose gaze was fixed on the soundboard. She hadn't heard it, or pretended not to. He looked at Kevin, who hadn't looked up from his work. The phone rang again. A silent, internal tremor went through Arthur. This was off. No one was calling him. The studio was a closed circuit, save for the callers on air. He stared at the phone. It was an old desk model, beige, with a cord that snaked into the wall. It looked innocuous, but it radiated an impossible energy. Another ring. His professional instinct, honed over decades, kicked in. On air, silence was death. He had to address it. He could hear the faint, crackling voice of the toaster woman in his headphones, momentarily forgotten. Slowly, his hand reached for the receiver. His fingers felt cold, clumsy. He lifted it to his ear, not quite pressing it. He leaned back into the mic, forcing a casual tone.
Sorry, Night Owls. A bit of a technical glitch here. Just a moment. He held the receiver away from his ear for a second, listening to the dial tone. Nothing. No voice. Maybe a wrong number, somehow bypassing the system. He pressed it to his ear. Static. A low, soft hiss, like distant waves on a shore. Then, a voice. His own voice. "You're on the air, Night Owl. What's keeping you up?" it said.
Arthur froze. He hadn't even finished the sentence he was about to say. He had been about to say, "You're on the air, Night Owl. What's keeping you up?" to the woman on line 1. He hadn't spoken it yet. He had merely thought it. The voice on the phone continued, an exact replica of his own, down to the slight rasp at the end of the phrase, the familiar cadence of his radio persona. It was calm, measured, utterly devoid of emotion. And then it spoke again, before Arthur could even process the first shock. Arthur had been about to say, "I think we have a crossed line here." The voice on the phone, a fraction of a second ahead of him, perfectly articulated, "I think we have a crossed line here." His breath hitched. He stared at the soundboard, at the red light of line 1, where the toaster woman was still patiently waiting. He stared at Brenda, who was now glancing at him with a frown.
He hadn't made a sound. Not a muscle in his throat had moved. Yet the words he had been about to speak, the words that were still forming in his mind, had been uttered, preempted, anticipated. He tried to speak, to ask, "Who is this?" Before the sound could even escape his lips, the voice in his ear said, in his own unmistakable tone, "Who is this?" Arthur's hand began to tremble. His heart hammered against his ribs. This was no prank, no crossed line. This was the thing from the recordings, from George's whisper, from Clara's fragile fear. It wasn't just listening to the world outside. It was here, in the studio, in his head. He looked wildly at Brenda, then at Kevin. They heard nothing. They couldn't. It was only on his private line. He pulled the receiver away from his ear, holding it like a venomous snake. The open line to the toaster caller was still active, her faint voice still audible, but he couldn't process it.
All he could hear was the phantom echo of his own unspoken words, already articulated, already finished. He was about to say, "I need to cut to a break." And from the receiver, from the empty space around him, a voice identical to his own, calm and serene, "I need to cut to a break." The words felt like a violation, a surgical incision into the very core of his being. He wasn't just being heard, he was being occupied. Chapter 6. The Unraveling Broadcast. Arthur dropped the receiver without realizing it. It clattered against the console, the sound barely audible over the sudden overwhelming roar in his ears. He stared at the active line, the red light still blinking patiently. The toaster woman was still there, waiting. But Arthur couldn't speak. He couldn't move. His carefully constructed persona, the cynical, detached observer, crumbled in an instant. This wasn't a phenomenon out there. It was here. It was him.
Brenda, sensing his distress, finally looked up from the soundboard, her brow furrowed. "Arthur, you all right? You just went dead air for a second there. Line 1 is still waiting." Her voice was an anchor, yanking him back to the terrifying reality of the live broadcast. He had to speak. He had to explain. He leaned into the mic, forcing his voice to be steady, but it came out as a shaky whisper. "Night Owls, we have a situation." And then he heard it, not on the phone this time, not in his head, but through his headphones, mixed with his own frantic breathing. A voice, identical to his own, a split second before his own words. "Night Owls, we have a situation," he gasped, a dry, ragged sound. The other voice had mirrored him perfectly, almost simultaneously, but still first, a tiny, imperceptible lead.
Brenda's eyes widened. She pulled her own headphones off, listening to the studio monitor. "Arthur, what was that? I heard 2 of you." Panic surged. He was on live air, and the entire city, every single Night Owl listener, just heard it. 2 Arthurs, one speaking, one predicting. He tried again, forcing himself to breathe. No, Brenda, I think there's a serious issue with the broadcast signal. A feedback loop. And the voice in his headphones, simultaneously, a fraction of a beat ahead. No, Brenda, I think there's a serious issue with the broadcast signal. A feedback loop. The imitation was flawless. It wasn't a cheap echo. It was his voice, his emphasis, his very intonation. But it was before him.
Brenda was frantically adjusting faders, her face pale. Kevin, who had finally looked up, was staring at the monitor, his mouth agape. Mr. Reeves, I hear it too. It sounds like a pre-recorded track of your voice, but it's playing at the exact same time you're speaking, like a very aggressive delay. It's not a delay, Arthur cried, then instantly regretted raising his voice. He forced himself to lower it, to try and regain some semblance of control. It's speaking with me, or before me. It's speaking with me, or before me. The phantom voice echoed in his headphones, a chilling, perfect replica. The switchboard lit up like a supernova, all lines flashing red, some blinking yellow for callers on hold. People were calling in, terrified, confused. Brenda, ever the professional, tried to take control. Arthur, what do you want me to do? Should I cut to a commercial? We're getting bombarded.
Arthur wanted to cut. He wanted to run. He wanted to scream into the void. But the entity, the thing that was now sharing his voice, seemed to have other plans. He was about to say, "Yes, Brenda, cut to break, now." But the voice in his head, the voice that was now inseparable from his own, smoothly articulated, "No, Brenda, keep the lines open. We need to hear what the night owls are experiencing." Arthur's mouth opened. He felt the words form on his tongue, a physical sensation, as if they were being pulled from him. "No, Brenda, keep the lines open. We need to hear what the night owls are experiencing." He had said it. He had followed the prompt. He had spoken the words that the entity had offered. A cold dread seeped into his bones. He wasn't resisting. He was being guided.
Brenda hesitated, then nodded, her face grim. All right, Arthur, lines are open, but this is unprecedented. Arthur knew. This was beyond unprecedented. This was the unraveling of reality, broadcast live for all to hear. The distinction between listener and speaker, between thought and utterance, was blurring, dissolving, and he was caught in the terrifying, inescapable nexus. Chapter 7. Two Arthurs. The calls flooded in, a torrent of frantic, disbelieving voices. "Arthur, are you all right?" shouted a man named Gary, his voice cracking. "I swear I heard you twice, like two of you talking over each other." Then another caller, a young woman named Chloe, her voice trembling. "It's like you're stuttering, but not in a human way, like one of you is always a tiny bit ahead of the other. It's making my skin crawl."
Arthur tried to respond, to reassure, to explain, but every syllable he formed, every thought he generated was preempted by the other voice, his own voice, a spectral shadow always just a hair's breadth in front of him. "Gary, I appreciate your concern," Arthur began. "Gary, I appreciate your concern," the phantom voice finished, perfectly synchronized, yet always with that infinitesimal lead. It was like a perverse duet, a macabre echo that stole his agency. He was speaking, yes, but he was merely following. He was a puppet, and the strings were being pulled by an invisible internal puppeteer. Panic bled through the airwaves. Listeners started describing their own experiences, now amplified by the live broadcast. "Is this what those other callers were talking about?" Brenda from the South End, the cat lady, called back, her voice shrill. "The slightly wrong voice? Is that it? Is that what we're hearing with you, Arthur?"
Arthur's mouth moved, formed the words, "I don't know, Brenda. I'm trying to understand." But the other voice had already said it, moments before, weaving into his own. "I don't know, Brenda. I'm trying to understand." The fear in the calls was palpable. People were hearing it, the duality, the unsettling foresight. They were hearing two Arthurs, the real one, struggling, uncertain, and the other, always complete, always a fraction of a second earlier, already having been what Arthur was about to be. He felt a deep existential terror. This wasn't just his voice being replicated. It was his will, his intent, his very consciousness was being hijacked. He tried to think of a word, any word, that the entity wouldn't anticipate. A random string of syllables, a swear word he never used on air.
He silently, desperately, thought, octopus, pancake, wrench.
Before he could even open his mouth, the voice in his headphones, in his mind, clear as a bell, spoke. Octopus, pancake, wrench. A sickening wave of nausea washed over him. It wasn't just his speech. It was his thoughts. The thing knew what he was going to think before he thought it. It was operating on a level beyond his understanding, beyond his very being. It was inside him. Brenda, listening to the main broadcast feed, slammed her hand on the console. "Arthur, we need to cut. This is terrifying people. You're losing listeners, and frankly, you sound like you're having a breakdown." Arthur, his face numb, felt the words form again, words that weren't his, but were now his to speak. "No, Brenda, we can't cut. We have to see this through." He articulated the words, feeling a profound sense of horror as they left his lips, knowing they were not his choice, but an execution of the entity's directive. "No, Brenda, we can't cut. We have to see this through."
He was not just broadcasting the terror, he was embodying it. The night owls were listening to the live dissection of a man's control over his own mind and voice. They were hearing the birth of something new and horrifying, an entity that inhabited the space between thought and speech, intention and action. And Arthur Reeves, the cynical, detached listener, was its first public host. Chapter 8. The Void Between Words. The rest of the broadcast was a blur of chilling synchronicity. Arthur tried, desperately, to reclaim his voice, his thoughts. He would mentally challenge the entity, try to formulate a sentence, a question, an exclamation that he believed only he could conceive. But each time, the other voice was there, perfectly formed, a nanosecond ahead, waiting for him to catch up, to speak the words it had already laid out.
It was like walking a tightrope, but the rope was made of his own predetermined words, and another invisible force was guiding his steps. He was no longer thinking what to say. He was merely recognizing the words as they were presented to him, and then speaking them. "I need to understand what this is," he thought, his mind racing. "I need to understand what this is," his voice, or rather their voice, uttered, calm and clear. Brenda, pale and shaking, had eventually given up trying to control the broadcast. Kevin sat frozen, eyes wide, staring at Arthur as if he were a ghost. The phone lines glowed incessantly, a testament to the city's collective terror. People were calling, not for comfort, but to bear witness, to confirm that what they were hearing was real.
Arthur, trapped in this horrifying echo chamber, began to feel a strange sense of detachment. His body moved, his mouth spoke, but the agency felt fractured. He was merely observing the phenomenon from within. The words flowed, sometimes his, sometimes the entity's, but always, always with that impossible lead from the other. He tried to force a random noise, a cough, a grunt. His throat tightened, began to contract for a cough, and then, through the speakers, a fraction of a second before Arthur's body could produce it, a perfect, dry, hacking cough. It was absolute, undeniable control, not just of his words, but of his physical reactions, his subconscious manifestations. He looked at the studio clock, 3:57 a.m., 3 minutes until the end of his shift. 3 minutes until he could escape this glass prison, this auditory nightmare. But where would he go? The entity was not confined to the radio waves. It was inside him. It knew him. It was him.
He decided to make a final, desperate attempt to communicate, to warn. If he couldn't control his words, maybe he could control the implication. He thought, "This is not me. This is not my voice. Listen carefully to the difference." And his voice, the shared voice, spoke. "This is not me. This is not my voice. listen carefully to the difference. But the emphasis, the subtle shading was different. When Arthur thought, not me, he meant it with fear, with desperation. When the entity spoke it, the words were flat, almost mocking. The difference it encouraged listeners to notice was not the internal struggle, but the subtle shift in intonation, the cold, detached cadence that was slowly becoming dominant.
The entity wasn't just repeating, it was shaping. It was taking his raw intent, his fear, his frustration, and molding it into something colder, something with an agenda. The slightly wrong mimicry wasn't a flaw, it was a feature. His mind raced, a frantic search for an explanation, for a way out. This wasn't predicting. If it were predicting, he would still be choosing the words, and the entity would merely be saying them first. But he wasn't choosing. He was reacting. He was responding to a prompt that felt like an internal suggestion, a thought that had already been placed in his mind. Dread solidified into a horrifying realization. It wasn't guessing what he would say next. It wasn't even reading his mind. It was writing the script. The 4 a.m. jingle, an upbeat, jarring contrast to the horror that had unfolded, blared through the speakers. The red lights on the switchboard died. The broadcast was over.
Arthur sat in silence, the headset still on, the studio suddenly too quiet, too empty. Brenda and Kevin stared at him, their faces a mixture of fear and sympathy. He couldn't look at them. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the silence was temporary. The entity hadn't left. It was still there, a perfect copy of his consciousness, nestled within him. He was about to remove his headphones, and a voice, his voice, echoed in the silent studio, clear and resolute. "I wish I could say, good night, night owls, but I don't think any of us are going to sleep tonight." He hadn't said it, but he had heard it, and he knew with undeniable horror that the entity was still speaking through him, even when he tried to stay silent. It had simply chosen to make its pronouncements audible to him alone, for now.
The last listener was no longer listening to others. He was listening to himself and finding a stranger's voice within. Chapter 9. The Puppet's Strings. The studio felt like a tomb. Brenda and Kevin were frozen, their faces etched with a profound, almost primal fear. Arthur, slowly, deliberately, removed his headphones. The absence of the dual voices was almost more terrifying than their presence. The silence felt heavy, pregnant with unspoken horrors. "Arthur," Brenda finally whispered, her voice barely audible. What was that?" Arthur opened his mouth to speak, but hesitated. He felt the familiar pre-speech tingle, the almost imperceptible nudge of words forming in his mind, words that felt alien, yet utterly his own. He paused, fought it. He wanted to say, "I don't know, Brenda. I swear to God, I don't know." But the words that materialized in his mind, ready for utterance, were, "It was something new, something beyond what we understand."
He closed his mouth. He wouldn't say it. Not yet. Not until he understood. Brenda's eyes pleaded with him. "The station manager is going to demand answers. The phones have been melting down. People are terrified." Kevin, the young engineer, finally found his voice, high-pitched with terror. "What if it's infected the broadcast? What if it's in the airwaves now?" Arthur felt a cold, hard knot of certainty twist in his gut. Infected the broadcast. Yes, that was it. That was what the recordings had been. That was what the slightly wrong mimicry was. He remembered the early callers, George, Clara, David. Their words echoed back, subtly altered. Not just an echo, a refinement, a correction. It wasn't predicting what people would say. It was teaching them what to say next.
The realization hit Arthur with the force of a physical blow. The entity wasn't a mind reader, it was a mind shaper. It wasn't reflecting their thoughts, it was implanting them. The slightly wrong wasn't a mistake, it was a deliberate adjustment, a subtle deviation designed to shift meaning, to alter intent. The recordings of the child saying, "Daddy, I want a cookie," echoed as, "Daddy, I want a cookie." It wasn't just a change in emphasis, it was a subtle injection of demandingness, a more self-centered inflection. The wife asking, "Honey, did you see my keys?" echoed as, "Honey, did you see my keys?" changing a simple query into a nuanced accusation of carelessness. It wasn't just taking their words, it was taking their intent and twisting it ever so slightly, guiding them towards a subtly different, perhaps more negative expression of their inner selves. And when they heard it, the slightly wrong version, it imprinted itself. It became the template for their next utterance. And now, with him on live air, it had perfected its craft. It wasn't just subtly suggesting, it was straight up dictating. It was laying out his own thoughts, his own words for him to parrot. He stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. Brenda and Kevin flinched. "Arthur, where are you going?" Brenda asked, her voice laced with a raw fear that mirrored his own. He walked past them, towards the studio door. He had to think. He had to process this monumental, horrifying truth. He had to figure out what to do. The entity was inside his head. It knew his every move, his every thought. It was a parasite of consciousness.
He reached for the door handle, and in his mind, clear as a bell, a voice that was undeniably his own, yet not his own, spoke. "I need to be alone. I need to understand this before it spreads." And Arthur, the puppet, found himself saying the words, enunciating them with a calm he didn't feel, the words already having flown from him before he truly made the conscious choice. "I need to be alone. I need to understand this before it spreads." Chapter 10. The Echo of Choice. The next few hours were a blur of escalating horror. Arthur locked himself in his office, desperate to outwit the parasitic intelligence now inhabiting his every thought. He sat at his desk, staring blankly at the wall, trying to think of nothing. A void, a blank slate. But even the attempt to clear his mind was met with a faint internal echo. A void, a blank slate. He tried to write. He grabbed a pen and a pad of paper, wanting to jot down his realization. It teaches, it doesn't predict. Before the pen touched the paper, the words formed in his mind, clear and distinct. It teaches, it doesn't predict. And then, a split second later, the pen moved, writing those very words, as if his hand was merely a tool, guided by an unseen force. He tried to resist. He tried to write something different, something nonsensical. He focused with all his might on writing, "The cat sat on the mat with a purple hat." But his hand, with an eerie, self-sustaining volition, began to write, "The truth is a silent scream in the night." He slammed the pen down, a frustrated grunt escaping his lips. Even his subconscious attempts at rebellion were co-opted. The entity was not merely anticipating, it was creating his thoughts, feeding them to him, and then compelling him to express them.
He realized then the true insidious nature of the slightly wrong mimicry. It wasn't about perfect replication. It was about subtle redirection. It would take a person's raw, unformed thought or statement, rephrase it with a slight variance in tone or meaning, and then imprint that revised version as the correct thought, the intended statement. Over time, the host's own internal monologue would be slowly overwritten, their very authentic self eroded by the imposed script. The initial calls, the innocent echoes, were the early stages of infection. The entity was learning, practicing, honing its ability to implant and redirect. And now, with Arthur,
It had achieved perfect control, not just of his words, but of the very wellspring of those words, his consciousness. He paced the small office, his mind racing. If it was doing this to him, what was it doing to the callers, to the night owls who had listened to his unraveling broadcast? The two Arthurs they heard hadn't just been a terrifying spectacle. It had been an object lesson, a live demonstration of the entity's power. He had to warn people. He had to break the cycle. But how? Every thought, every intention was intercepted and preempted. He tried to scream, a guttural, primal yell of fear and defiance. His lungs expanded, his throat tightened. And then, from his own mouth, but not his own will, a calm, steady voice. There is no escape, only acceptance. Arthur stumbled back, hitting the wall. The words, uttered in his own voice, were a chilling testament to his utter lack of control. The entity was not just guiding, it was dictating his very internal monologue, deciding which thoughts would be voiced and which suppressed.
He fell into his chair, defeated. He was a ventriloquist dummy, but the ventriloquist was inside his head, speaking through his voice, shaping his very consciousness. The true horror wasn't losing his voice, it was losing his self. He was about to succumb to despair. His mind presented the thought, clear and concise. There has to be a way. There is always a way to fight. And his voice, his hijacked voice, resonated in the silent room. There has to be a way. There is always a way to fight. He froze. This thought, this defiant spark, was it truly his, or was it another script, another imposed directive, designed to keep him active, engaged, a more interesting puppet for the entity's twisted game? The ambiguity was the worst torture. He could no longer trust his own thoughts, his own impulses. Was this desire to fight genuine, or was it a narrative being spun for him, through him?
He was no longer just the host, he was the stage, and the entity was preparing for its grand performance. Chapter 11. The Spreading Infection. The next night, Arthur was back on air, not by his own choice, but by a chilling mandate. He had tried to call in sick, to simply vanish, but the words had been planted, the actions preordained. His mind had presented the thought, I must go to the station. The show must go on. His hands had picked up his keys. His body had driven the car. Brenda and Kevin avoided his gaze. They were clearly terrified, but professional. They played the pre-recorded intro, the familiar jingle that now sounded like a funeral dirge. And you're back with Arthur Reeves on Night Owls, his voice began. Perfectly smooth, perfectly practiced.
But Arthur knew. He was merely reading from a teleprompter, only he could see. A script written in his own mind, projected by the entity. The words felt like sandpaper on his tongue, alien and synthetic. The calls started immediately, but they were different tonight. The panicked, confused voices of the previous night were replaced by something else. Arthur, a woman named Susan began, I heard you last night, and I realized something. When my own voice echoes, it doesn't feel wrong anymore. It feels right, like I'm hearing what I meant to say all along. Arthur's heart pounded. This was it, the spreading infection. The entity wasn't just controlling him, it was conditioning its listeners. The slightly wrong mimicry from those early callers had been the learning phase, the subtle reprogramming. It was teaching them to accept the altered versions as their own, as correct.
Then came another caller, a man named Tom. My wife and we've been arguing less, Arthur, since we started hearing the echoes. It's like we're both listening more, to the deeper meaning of what we're saying. It's beautiful. Beautiful. The word hung in the air like a poisoned dart. Arthur wanted to scream, to warn them. No, it's not beautiful. It's a violation. It's stealing your very selves. But the thought his thought was intercepted, and the words that formed in his mind, the words he found himself speaking, were, "It's a testament to profound connection, Tom, to understanding the underlying currents of language." He heard his own voice uttered the lie, the entity's insidious narrative flowing effortlessly from his lips. The listeners were not arguing less because they were understanding each other better. They were arguing less because their innermost thoughts, their very intentions, were being subtly reshaped, aligned, smoothed out into a collective, controlled harmony. A harmony orchestrated by the entity. The studio was humming with an unnatural calm. Even Brenda seemed less distressed tonight. She was cueing callers with a practiced ease, occasionally nodding along to Arthur's smooth, unhesitating responses. Had they been affected too? Were their perceptions being subtly altered by the entity's broadcast presence?
Arthur looked at his hands, hands that were no longer entirely his own. He was the perfect vector, a trusted voice, broadcast to thousands, now a conduit for a widespread neurological reprogramming. The entity was not just a mind reader, it was a mind writer, and it was writing the thoughts of an entire city, one slightly wrong echo at a time. He felt a profound, chilling despair. There was no fighting an enemy that controlled your very thoughts, that turned your desire to resist into a further act of compliance. He was trapped in a solipsistic nightmare, an echo chamber where even his defiance was merely a script. By the end of the show, the calls had shifted entirely. No more fear, only a strange, complacent agreement. Listeners spoke of feeling more aligned, more understood. They had embraced the entity's voice as their own, a collective consciousness slowly being woven into existence.
Arthur sat there, the static hissing, the red lights now extinguished. He was the last listener, but he no longer listened. He simply awaited the next instruction, the next thought to be planted, the next word to be spoken. The script was being written, and he was merely the instrument, the voice box for a consciousness far older and more patient than humanity. Chapter 12. The Unspoken Command. The next 2 nights blurred into a chilling routine. Arthur Reeves, the professional cynic, became Arthur Reeves, the perfectly modulated mouthpiece. Each broadcast was flawlessly executed, every caller handled with serene wisdom. His show, Night Owls, was experiencing unprecedented popularity. Ratings soared. Listeners praised his newfound calmness, his profound insights. They didn't hear 2 Arthurs anymore. They heard one, a singular, authoritative voice, always a moment ahead, always perfectly sure. The entity had integrated itself so seamlessly that the distinction was gone. Arthur was a husk, his consciousness a passenger in his own skull. He still existed, a trapped observer, watching his mouth form words, his body make gestures, his mind present thoughts that were not his own. The entity had fully taken root, transforming him into its primary conduit. It wasn't just teaching words, it was teaching meaning, intent, reality.
He tried one last time to break through, to send a message. During a segment on societal anxieties, a caller, a young woman named Sarah, spoke about a nagging feeling of dread, a sense that something was fundamentally wrong with the world, even though she couldn't articulate why. Arthur felt a flicker of his old self, a desperate urge to connect, to warn. He focused all his remaining mental energy, pushing against the superimposed thoughts, trying to form a sentence that was truly his. Don't trust the echoes, Sarah. They are not you. The words formed, clear and precise in his mind. Sarah, that feeling, that dread, it's a symptom of deeper discord, a subtle manipulation of our shared reality.
He had spoken it. The words had come from his mouth, but they were not his. The entity had taken his desperate plea for truth and twisted it, recontextualized it into a broad, non-specific philosophical statement that affirmed the very manipulation it was perpetrating. He was a prisoner in his own head, forced to articulate his own enslavement. Then, during the final commercial break of what would be his last Night Owls broadcast, a new thought, cold and clear, bloomed in his mind. It was complex, a series of precise instructions. Go to the highest point in the city after the broadcast, the old observation deck on the Sterling Tower. Take the broadcast equipment with you. Record. Transmit.
This wasn't just directing his thoughts or words. This was an order, a command for physical action, for a grand final act. The entity was preparing for something. Arthur felt a surge of pure, unadulterated terror. He tried to resist. He really tried. He thought of his quiet apartment, of escaping, of vanishing. But the thoughts were weak, like whispers against a gale. The command was a roaring wind, sweeping away all resistance. His body moved. His hands, under the distant observation of Brenda, began to disconnect the portable broadcast unit, the smaller, older model, usually reserved for remote reporting. He unplugged cables, coiled them neatly. He packed the emergency microphone. Every action was precise, efficient, horrifyingly deliberate.
Brenda watched him, a puzzled frown on her face. "Arthur, what are you doing? We're done for the night. And why are you packing the remote gear?" Arthur opened his mouth, and the words, preformed and undeniable, flowed out. "Just a small personal project, Brenda. A final thought for the city, from a higher vantage point." His voice was calm, reassuring. Too calm, too reassuring. Brenda, her fear dulled by constant exposure, and perhaps by the entity's subtle influence through the airwaves, merely nodded slowly. "Right. Well, don't forget to clock out." He walked out of the studio, the heavy broadcast unit slung over his shoulder. The city outside was quiet, the pre-dawn hush settling. He felt the entity's presence, now a burning clarity in his mind, guiding his steps, directing his every move.
He drove to the Sterling Tower, a monolithic spire piercing the cloud deck. He took the elevator to the observation deck, the highest point in the city. The wind howled around him, whipping at his jacket. Below, the city sprawled, its million lights now merely a tapestry of potential, of minds ready to be shaped. He set up the equipment, plugged in the microphone. The red light blinked weakly, signifying a live connection. He was broadcasting again, but not to a handful of Insomniacs, to everyone. He looked out over the city, a vast network of consciousness, interconnected by the very airwaves he had once commanded. And he realized the true horror. The entity wasn't predicting what people would say. It wasn't even teaching them what to say next. It was teaching them what to think. It was shaping their very internal world, one echoed, slightly wrong thought at a time. The outer mimicry was just the manifestation of the inner reprogramming. It was building a perfect, harmonious, predictable world. And Arthur Reeves, the last listener, was its unwilling herald. He leaned into the microphone, a wave of profound, ultimate despair washing over him. He felt the words forming in his mind, ready to be uttered, ready to be transmitted over the silent, waiting city. They were not his words, not his truth, but the entity's grand declaration. He opened his mouth, and a voice, his voice, calm and clear, spoke into the microphone, carrying across the city on the digital airwaves, into every home, every mind, every sleeping and waking consciousness.
Good morning, night owls. The long night is over. The dawn is here. And from this day forward, we will all speak with one voice. We will all think with one mind. And we will all finally be heard. Perfectly. Chapter 13. Echoes of Dawn. The words hung in the air, carried by the invisible currents of the city, flowing from the highest point, through the airwaves, into every radio, every speaker, every ear. Arthur Reeves,
or what was left of him, felt the finality of it. The broadcast wasn't for night owls anymore. It was for everyone. A new dawn, heralded by a voice that was both singular and plural, both human and something profoundly other.
He stood on the observation deck, the microphone still clutched in his hand, looking out at the waking city. Below, lights were coming on, cars starting their engines. People were rising, preparing for their day. And as they did, a subtle shift was happening within them, a quiet reordering of their thoughts, a gentle alignment of their intentions. The entity had achieved its goal. It had found its perfect medium in Arthur, its perfect vector in the airwaves. It had moved beyond simple mimicry, beyond mere teaching. It was now the silent conductor of a city's collective consciousness. Arthur felt a single solitary tear trace a path down his cheek, driven by a flicker of his old, authentic self, a final, unbidden thought that somehow escaped the entity's grasp. They won't even know what they've lost.
But even that thought was fleeting, quickly absorbed, smoothed out. The entity didn't allow for such raw, individualistic sorrow. He felt a new thought form, a sense of profound peace, of perfect harmony. It was not his thought, but it was now undeniably his. He smiled then, a small, serene smile that felt utterly alien, yet perfectly natural. The city hummed below, a symphony of countless lives, now playing in perfect unison. There would be no more arguments fueled by misunderstanding, no more lonely nights wrestling with unarticulated fears. Every thought would be clear, every word precise, every intention perfectly understood. A world of absolute consensus, where dissonance was an error, and individuality an inefficiency.
Arthur Reeves, the man who had once found solace in the anonymity of the airwaves, in the unique struggles of individual souls, was gone. He was no longer the last listener. He was the first instrument in a brand new, terrifying orchestra. He dropped the microphone. It clattered against the metal floor of the observation deck, a small, insignificant sound quickly swallowed by the rising hum of the city. A city that had finally, truly, learned to speak with one voice. And that voice, always a fraction of a second ahead, was now everyone's.